Reagan's private doubt during his loudest victory. The crowd roared, but he felt strangely distant. Triumph echoed everywhere, yet certainty did not. In the moment he looked strongest, doubt spoke the loudest. To understand Ronald Reagan's presidency, we have to look past the landslides, the slogans, and the confident smile. We have to return to the instant when victory felt complete. But the cost of that victory became impossible to ignore, because leadership is often tested not in failure, but in success that arrives too quickly and demands more than it promises. By the mid-1980s, Reagan stood at the height of his power. The economy had rebounded. His political coalition dominated Washington. His rhetoric had reshaped how Americans spoke about government, strength, and national pride. Abroad, he had projected confidence against rivals who once seemed immovable. To supporters, it felt like renewal. To critics, like recklessness. To Reagan himself, it felt heavier than expected. Reagan believed deeply in optimism, in clarity, in the power of belief to change outcomes. But he was not blind. Beneath the speeches, he absorbed briefings that told a darker story. Military escalations, close calls, systems running at the edge of control. The louder the applause grew, the more fragile the balance appeared. This tension sharpened after his re-election. Mandate secured, authority unquestioned, expectations absolute. Reagan now had the freedom to push further, to harden positions, to cement legacy. Instead, something unexpected happened. He slowed down. The Cold War was still alive. Weapons were still pointed. Mistakes still carried the possibility of annihilation. Reagan had spent years speaking in absolutes, drawing clear lines between good and evil. But power had given him proximity to consequence, and consequence complicated certainty. Privately, Reagan began to question whether rhetoric alone could keep catastrophe at bay, whether strength without understanding invited disaster. He did not abandon his beliefs. He began to test them against reality. This was the beginning of Reagan's quiet conflict, a president celebrated for confidence, privately wrestling with the limits of that confidence, a leader learning that winning can expose dangers losing never reveals. The victory was real, but so was the doubt. That doubt grew in the space between speeches and briefings, between what was said publicly and what was understood privately. Behind closed doors, Reagan confronted information that never reached campaign stages. Intelligence reports detailed near misses, misread signals, moments where escalation came down to minutes, or individuals choosing restraint over protocol. The machinery of deterrence looked less stable the closer he stood to it. Advisors were divided. Some urged continued pressure, believing strength would force collapse. Others warned that the system was too tense, too reactive, too vulnerable to accident. Reagan listened more carefully than his public image suggested. The actor who delivered certainty had learned the discipline of pause. This internal shift did not come easily. Reagan's identity was tied to confidence, to clarity, to the belief that optimism itself was strategic. Doubt felt like betrayal of that image. Yet the presidency had placed him too close to consequence to ignore it. The louder the Cold War rhetoric grew, the more he feared it might trap both sides in momentum neither could escape. Then came moments that sharpened his concern. Military exercises misinterpreted as attack. Communications delayed or misunderstood. The realization that systems designed to prevent war could just as easily trigger it. Reagan began to see how easily confidence could slide into catastrophe. Publicly, he remained firm. Privately, he softened. He questioned assumptions. He pushed advisors to consider alternatives once dismissed as naive. Dialogue, de-escalation, mutual reduction, ideas that contradicted years of hardened posture. This was the early conflict of his second act, not strength versus weakness, but certainty versus survival. Reagan did not renounce his beliefs. He began to reinterpret them. Strength, he realized, might also mean restraint. Victory might also mean stepping back. The doubt was not visible to crowds, but it was reshaping the presidency from within. The conflict reached its emotional peak when doubt became direction, and direction demanded risk. Reagan began moving toward dialogue in a political climate that rewarded confrontation. He shocked allies and unsettled critics by reopening channels once considered dangerous. Meetings were proposed, language softened, Assumptions were challenged. To many, it looked like retreat. To Reagan, it felt like necessity. The risk was enormous. Any misstep could be framed as weakness. Any compromise could fracture his coalition. Years of rhetoric stood in tension with the path he was choosing. Reagan understood this contradiction. He accepted it anyway. Privately, he spoke of fear. Not fear of enemies, but fear of accident, of miscalculation, of a world ending not through intent, but through momentum. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the Cold War could not be managed forever. It had to be changed. This realization transformed his leadership. He approached negotiations with sincerity rather than performance. He listened. He asked questions. He resisted advisors who treated dialogue as theater. The presidency shifted from projection to engagement. The emotional strain was constant. Reagan balanced public confidence with private vulnerability. He continued speaking in optimistic tones while wrestling with the possibility that optimism alone could not prevent disaster. The louder his victory seemed, the more urgent restraint became. This was the true conflict of his presidency. Not defeating an enemy, but disarming a system that fed on fear. He was no longer fighting an opponent across borders. He was confronting the logic of escalation itself. And by choosing engagement over dominance, Reagan risked the very image that had brought him power. But for the first time, he believed the risk was worth it. The resolution arrived quietly, without triumphal language. Agreements were signed. Weapons were reduced. Lines of communication widened. The Cold War did not end in Reagan's term, but something fundamental shifted. The assumption that escalation was inevitable began to weaken. Doubt, once private, had reshaped policy. Reagan never publicly framed this shift as reversal. He presented it as confidence fulfilled rather than abandoned. Strength, he argued, had created space for dialogue. But beneath the framing was honesty. He had seen how close the world stood to disaster, and he chose to step back before certainty became catastrophe. This was the climax of his presidency. Not the landslides, not the slogans, but the willingness to let doubt guide action when victory had already been secured. Reagan proved that leadership does not end when power peaks. It is tested there. His story matters because it reframes success. Loud victories can mask fragile systems. Confidence can blind as easily as it can inspire. Reagan's private doubt did not weaken him. It saved him from pushing too far. The presidency he left behind was still powerful, still armed, still dangerous. But it had been nudged away from the brink, not by fear, but by a leader willing to listen to his own unease. History often remembers Reagan's certainty. It should also remember the moment he let doubt speak. Because sometimes, the strongest choice is to slow down when everyone expects you to charge ahead. Reagan